Welcome to the People on the Margins series, hosted by Decatur First United Methodist Church. Today we have Brionté McCorkle, the Executive Director of Georgia Conservation Voters, to talk to us about 50 years of Earth Day on EJ and advocacy.
Hey everybody, my name is Brionté. As Michael said, I'm the Director of Georgia Conservation Voters. For those of you who are not familiar with Georgia Conservation Voters, we are the state affiliate of the League of Conservation Voters, and what we do is work to advance policies that, work to pass policies that advance climate and environmental justice. We support elected officials who make those things a priority, and we hold them accountable to their actions and votes on the issue. I am super happy to be here talking about 50 years of Earth Day, and specifically talking about environmental justice and environmental advocacy. I think right now the environment is on everybody's mind in a way that's more emphasizing public health. And so I'm going to dive into this presentation. I'm going to kick it off with a couple of points about the connections between climate change and coronavirus. And then I'll pivot into some discussion about what solutions look like and what you can do, how you can advocate for a brighter future. So the two things, these are two crises that are really urgent and pressing today. And they have quite a bit in common. Both were dismissed as hoaxes initially, despite the science. A lot of folks were saying that coronavirus wasn't a big deal, that it was being exaggerated, that it wasn't going to have a huge impact, it was going to be concentrated to just one area. We know that is not the case now that it has, we are now several months away from when it was first named and announced. The same thing has happened with climate change. It's dismissed as a hoax for many years. We lost a lot of ground in solving climate change because it was dismissed. And now everyone acknowledges that climate change is happening. They're still arguing about what caused it. I'd like us to move into solutions, but these are the things that climate change has in common with coronavirus. Another thing that they have in common is that the U.S. has delayed taking action. There's been a lack of leadership. Both of these things, coronavirus and climate change, will have a dramatic and long-lasting impact on all aspects of our society. Both of these things exploit the most vulnerable in our society. And they both will require policy changes and massive investment to mitigate. So climate change and coronavirus, two different crises, both urgent, with a lot in common. And so I like this quote from Naomi Klein. It says, "We face so many overlapping and intersecting crises that we can't afford to fix them one at a time. We need integrated solutions." This is really important to share with everyone, because this is actually, when I started as a young activist, very bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, I was organizing on mass transit expansion, and I was working for the Sierra Club at the time. And we were trying to expand MARTA to Clayton County. And I was like, yes, let's expand transit. Let's get these cars off the road. It's going to be great. We're going to burn less oil. And the community was like, I'm sorry, what? They were more interested in access to jobs, access to education, and improvement in quality of life. Because they had transit, they lost it and experienced a notable decline. And what I learned in that instance was that we actually can solve many issues, many environmental issues, and social justice issues at the same time. Expanding transit is one of those things. So is building a clean energy economy. So is adopting a different food system. There's a lot of things that we can do for social justice and environment simultaneously, and I'm glad that this is where the environmental movement has evolved to. It is an exciting place to be, and I think we are going to continue to grow this movement as we continue to talk about how these things solve multiple problems. And so if we're going to talk about solutions, we got to talk about environmental justice. And I like to lead with environmental justice because it is such an important topic. And you can't really develop solutions without talking about it. And so I like the way that Mustafa Ali, he's the former head of environmental justice at the EPA. I like what he says about environmental justice, how he defined it. It's the things that no one else wants. They place them in communities of color, low-income communities, and indigenous lands, and they become the sacrifice zones. This is really poignant for where we are right now with coronavirus. And I'm going to talk about some of that, but let me first talk about the burden of pollution. 55.9% of the people that live within 1.86 miles of toxic waste facilities are people of color. So more than half of the people living nearby are Black and brown communities. And of the children who are poisoned by lead, about 64% of them are African American. That's 5 times higher than white children, 5 times higher. And African Americans that live near coal-fired power plants, 68% of African Americans live within 30 miles of a coal plant. Only 32% live outside of that. And why 30 miles is important is because 30 miles is where you're going to experience most of the impact from the pollution of that coal plant. So these are just a few statistics of many that have highlighted the ways in which communities of color are carrying the burden of existing environmental pollution. And so I talk about environmental justice because if we don't make these connections, we lose likely allies. And this is something I think the environmental movement is now very much aware of, how not talking about these things for many years undermined our power because we were speaking with separate voices about the same issues. It's important because the communities of color are on the front lines. They're experiencing this pollution, and they will experience climate change as we start to feel the impacts from that. They'll be on the front lines of the flooding, of the drought, of the heat waves, the wildfires, and disease. This coronavirus situation is something that we have anticipated with a changing climate. We'll see more diseases, evolving diseases that are going to be harder and harder to contain. And so we have to acknowledge that these communities are on the front lines. Also, political power, right? The communities that are most impacted by these environmental justice are strong supporters of action on climate change. They want to see environmental pollution cleaned up. And this is consistent poll after poll all over the country. They are the strongest supporters for pro-environment action. But they are also underrepresented at the polls due to rapid voter suppression, which is something that Georgia has been on the national stage under a microscope about for the past several years. Communities sort of feeling very frustrated by the hurdles they have to go over to overcome just to cast their vote. So if the communities that are saying this is important to me, this is one of my top things I want to see this addressed, are not able to make it to the polls, we lose some political power there. So we've got to be aware of these dynamics as environmental advocates and activists. And I also think it's important to talk about it because we need to be developing solutions for all. The impacts of climate change are felt in health, they're felt in the economy, they're felt in the overall quality of life. And since communities of color are at the center of these impacts, they must be a part of developing the solutions so that we don't push the problem around and that we actually solve it for everyone. And to the point about pushing the problem around, in the past, I think the environmental movement would typically broker solutions that were inadequate for the communities of color. And as a result, maybe they successfully beat back a power plant from being in one community, but then it just ended up in another community. So you never really stopped the problem, you just moved it around. And that's insufficient. We can't keep pushing the problem around. There's nowhere we can put pollution There's nowhere where we can pollute the air and that not exacerbate climate change for all of us, right? And so in the 1990s, I like to talk about this. There was a Southwest organizing project letter to the Big Ten. So the Big Ten would be the big green environmental organizations that come to mind, the Greenpeaces and the National Resource Defense Councils of the world. There were local community groups, social justice groups that wrote a letter saying, look, you continue to support and promote these policies that clean up the environment on the backs of working people and in general people of color, and that you do this in the name of eliminating environmental hazards at any cost, but that cost is felt in communities of color. And if we're going to get, basically, I'm over here paraphrasing what's written here, but basically what they're saying is not that we don't want these things shut down, but that we need to be a part of the discussion. We need to be at the table with the environmental groups. So, because we've got to make sure that these solutions work for everyone. If we shut down a coal plant and it employs an entire community, the community then starts to look at the environmental movement as the enemy, as pro-environment and climate action being problematic for their livelihood. And only when we're sitting together, negotiating together, do we come up with a solution that works for everyone. And so I think it's important to acknowledge the growth that the environmental community has experienced over the past 5 decades since Earth Day. But we still have a long way to go, because the burden that I talked about is still there. It's still being felt by communities. We are working more closely together. But when we talk about the impacts of that burden, when we talk about how communities of color are on the front lines, you can see that with coronavirus. There have been studies that have come out that have said that air pollution is linked with higher COVID-19 fatality rates. On average, Black Americans are 2.4 times more likely to not bode well, to die of COVID-19 than white Americans. And when you're talking about air pollution, we know that that is mostly communities of color. There are communities of color that have higher rates of air pollution. And this chart, actually, this image, I actually found it today. I stumbled upon a study that was done by the University of Minnesota about where air pollution was being generated and where the impacts of the air pollution was being felt. And it basically says that about 17% of non-Hispanic whites, they experience 17% less of the air pollution than they actually generate. Hispanics experience 63% more air pollution than they actually generate. And Black communities, they experience 56% more air pollution than they generate. So these communities are experiencing the air pollution. They're not necessarily the ones generating the air pollution, but now it's caused a problem for coronavirus, and that they are getting higher rates of mortality because of these things. So, you know, the relationship between coronavirus, between climate change, between coronavirus and environmental justice is there. It is clear, and we need to be tackling these things, as I said earlier, simultaneously. And so the question is, where do we go from here? How do we fix this? If you're like me, this is the space that I like to be in. I think that there's a lot of things that we could despair about, but I like to think about what the future looks like. What are the opportunities that we have to build a better system? I've talked about it on basically this week on other calls, but although coronavirus is by all means a pretty drastic and terrible thing that we will all pretty much remember for decades, it does present an opportunity, because if we head into a recession, as is expected, what is needed to get us out of recession? Well, investment. There's going to be money being poured into the economy. And what an opportunity we have to make the investments in environmental initiatives, in green infrastructure, in transitioning our electricity sector, in expanding mass transit, building sustainable water systems. There are tons of opportunities that we have to put people back to work, create high quality jobs as we recover from coronavirus, and also be making a ton of progress on climate. And so I know that when I talk to environmentalists all over Georgia, of all ages, of all backgrounds, there is a general sense, yes, we need to do something about climate change, but what needs to be done isn't always as clear. People want to see action, but not everyone's clear on what that action looks like. And so I usually do this presentation in person, and I ask people if they're familiar with Project Drawdown, because for me, it is one of the most comprehensive studies I've ever seen of the different solutions to climate change, the things that we could be doing to actually make progress on this issue. And it ranks these different solutions from top to bottom in terms of effectiveness on mitigating climate, cutting down air emissions, carbon emissions. And so it is applied on a global scale. So I'm going to talk about this, but I'm going to acknowledge that this is a global thing, right? It's not specific to Georgia. But on a global scale, the top 5 solutions for curbing climate change are managing refrigeration chemicals, cutting down food waste, restoring tropical forests, and eating more plants and less meat, and installing onshore wind turbines. All of these are the top 5. And if in person, I would ask whether or not people could rank them. So I'm going to give you a second, just a minute, to think about these things and see if you can rank them from 1 to 5, from the most effective to the least effective.
I don't know how to do a poll yet, but why don't people take a shot in the chat and see what we get.
Brionté, while we're doing that, are you moving forward on slides? Because we're just seeing the first title slide right now.
Oh. Bring my shared window to the front. Do you see it? Do you see the slides? Okay, perfect. Oh, I'm so sorry, y'all. Y'all missed all of my beautiful pictures. This is the graphic I was talking about with air pollution, so sorry about that. And these are the solutions here that I'm asking you all to rank. And here I thought I was a Zoom pro. Okay, so let's see how folks did. So the top 1 of the 5 solutions is actually managing refrigeration chemicals. I know, it's not the first thing you think of when you think about solving climate. We also have installing onshore wind turbines. Cutting down food waste is number 3. Eating more plants and less meat is number 4. And number 5 is restoring our tropical forests. So all of this is not necessarily intuitive, but I think it's important to share because we need a clear roadmap. We need a clear set of policies that will move us to a more sustainable future. And what I like about Project Drawdown is that they've looked at so many of the things we've talked about, all these different levers, and these are the most effective. And what's exciting is there's a group called Georgia Drawdown, and they are trying to take that book and adopt it to Georgia and make it Georgia specific. So in the coming months, we'll have a roadmap that is studied, that says these are going to be the most effective levers for mitigating climate change in Georgia. So I like to share this. Again, it's on a global scale, but we do have some brilliant minds at UGA, at Georgia Tech, and I believe Emory University. I have to double check that, but there's several of Georgia's very wonderful institutions working on making a roadmap for Georgia. But until we get that roadmap, you should check out Project Drawdown. And I want to tell you a little bit about what we're working on. I think that it's really important that we move to a 100% clean energy economy. We need a strong 100% clean energy commitment at the state level, ideally at the federal level, but if we can't get it there, the state. We've seen states making those commitments across the country. I'd like to see Georgia take that kind of leadership. We know that there's tons of wonderful benefits for moving to clean energy in terms of carbon emissions, but also for the economy, which we know is important for our Georgia's leadership. Clean energy sector is employing tons of people. We want renewable portfolio standards. If we don't get 100% clean energy, then just some standard for what the utility should be investing in. Right now, if you look at Georgia Power's energy mix, renewables are such a small part of their energy generation. So we want to make sure that they increase how much money they're investing in renewable energy, because it is going to be critical for us in the future to be resilient. So I see a nodding head. So, and the thing is, we need to stop investing in fossil fuels. We just do. We've got a lot of fossil fuel subsidies at the federal level going to these companies, and it's unacceptable. We don't need to be spending more money doing things like drilling off Georgia's coast, right? That's still something that's in play. We're still talking about destroying the coastline of Savannah and Brunswick and some of Georgia's most beautiful and treasured islands. We can't allow that to happen. It's unnecessary when we have cleaner forms of energy available. We should be investing in clean transportation. The transportation sector is the sector that produces the most carbon emissions in the United States. We need to strengthen clean car standards. Since coronavirus has been in the news cycle, in the background, our president has rolled back all of the clean car standards that were passed during the Obama administration. It is an absolute outrage. They were working, they were successful, and we've seen that rolled back. And we have the technology to produce more efficient cars. There's no reason why we need to be rolling back standards. We need to promote the use of electric vehicles. We need more charging infrastructure to make electric vehicles work. And we need to expand public transit. We need to give people alternative options to moving around that don't involve getting in a vehicle, that don't involve sitting in traffic and spewing out air emissions. So these are things that we'd like to see happen. And the other thing is, we're working, GCV is working on voter turnout. We've got lots of environmentalists in Georgia, people who say that this is really important to them. There's widespread support for these pro-environment and climate mitigating policies. The challenge is translating that electorally. We need to make sure that environmentalists are hitting the polls in every election, down the ballot, and they understand that their vote matters. Every vote matters. Every vote counts. Because if the elected officials don't feel like environmentalists are really voting, then they don't feel like the environmentalists are going to really hold them accountable. So it's important that we get more people who we know are pro-environment to hit the polls. And so that's something that we're working on at GCV. And so at this point, I want to talk about advocacy in general. So I want to talk about what civic engagement means to folks. Why does it matter? We got a lot of pro-environment people, as I said, and they're taking action in different ways. And being an environmental advocate isn't a one-size-fits-all cookie cutter. This is the checklist for the things that make you an environmental activist. It shows up in different ways for people. But it's all about making sure that you're engaged civically. And so just talking about civic engagement, it's really just working to make a difference in the civic life of one's community and developing the combination of knowledge, skills, values, and motivation to make that difference. So it's as much about doing as it is about learning, as it is about showing up and being present and figuring out how to be a better advocate for environment. And so there's a lot of different ways that civic engagement can look. You can get involved in the community problem solving. This is one of my favorite spaces to be. I love it when people come together and decide that they're going to take their power back and do something about the things happening in their community. One of the groups that has caught my attention are the folks advocating to clean up the South River. It's a river that runs through South DeKalb and Fulton County. And all the way down through Rockdale, goes all the way out to our coast. It's a beautiful river, but it is polluted. And there is a community that's been dedicated to getting it cleaned up. They go out and regularly help clean it up with the South River Watershed Alliance. And they've been trying to fight some of the efforts to swap land nearby for film studios that was supposed to be for parks, beautiful, high quality land. So this is just an example of folks coming together to solve a problem in their community. And no matter what the problem is, big or small, this is valuable. I've had on my own street, some ladies, they come outside once a week and they just clean up the street, and then they powwow and they talk about all of the things that they want to do to beautify the community and keep it clean. That's community problem solving at its best, and it's valuable. Regular volunteering for a non-electoral organization is another great way to get involved. There are tons of really awesome organizations in Atlanta and Georgia that are doing wonderful things like planting trees, doing community cleanups, helping to maintain community gardens. All of these are good ways to get involved. Don't let anybody tell you that it's too small, because it does matter. Active membership in those organizations is important. Organizations do need support from people. They do need to have a base. So if you join one of these organizations, it will be rewarding, especially if this is your passion to take action on environment. And then in participating in fundraising, the movement must be funded. So, any dollar amount, $5, $10 here or there, asking your friends to give to organizations that you see doing great work, all of that is very, very valued. Moving into political voice, this is the more political way that environment shows up. It's sending email petitions to elected officials on lots of different issues, contacting officials on the phone or on social media, contacting or submitting letters to the editor, op-eds to the media. That is always really important, letting your community know what you feel and getting that out in the paper. Signing written petitions, canvassing, going door to door, talking to your neighbors. We're not doing a lot of that right now, but maybe it'll pick up when things are a little bit safer. And then protesting of all kinds. All of those are ways to be an environmental activist and be civically engaged politically. And there's electoral. There's regular voting, which is important. Please go vote. We've got elections coming up. I know it's a little hard to keep track of these election dates. I'll get you some dates a little bit later in the presentation. Persuading others to vote. Never take for granted that the people you know are voting. You'll be surprised. Every election, I text my family. I text my mom. I'm like, hey, election day, what's your plan? When are you going? And they're always grateful. You might think people are really on it, but sometimes they need that reminder. Sometimes they weren't thinking about it at all, and that text from you makes the difference between them making their voices heard at the polls and not. So please take a moment to think about people nearby, people you care about, and encourage them to hit the polls when you know that an election is coming up. You can display buttons, signs, and stickers. I've got stickers on the back of my car. I got a team member that loves wearing buttons. Whatever you do, that's a message. Someone is reading my sticker. Somebody is reading her buttons. That's one simple way to spread the word about the things you care about. Campaign contributions, so a lot of that happening right now. We really need to support great candidates, people who prioritize environment, people who will prioritize passing policies and investing in these different environmental and climate change initiatives. Running for office is really, really important. I'm going to ask everyone who's listening to run for office. Just think about it. And I do that because a lot of people need to be asked several times. I think that a woman has to be asked on average. I'm going to mess that statistic up. Anyway, women have to be asked a lot. People in general have to be asked a lot to run. We need leadership, and that could be you. So think about it. And registering voters is really important. Getting people on the rolls. We've got voter purges in the hundreds of thousands happening here in Georgia every year. So make sure that you're checking your voter registration, because some people are getting, purged off the rolls, and they're showing up at the polls on election day, and they're surprised that they're not registered. So don't take your own registration for granted. Check on that. I'll give you a website to do that in a little bit. And definitely make sure that you're encouraging other people to register to vote. And I skipped over volunteering. If you don't want to give to a candidate, if you find a really strong pro-environment candidate that you want to support, volunteering for them is also a really great way to be engaged. They need help. Help is hard to come by. So definitely consider, jumping in and lending out a helping hand. So if folks can put in the chat box an answer to this question, what keeps you from engaging? I'm always curious to sort of hear some of the different things that keep people from being more civically involved. I know a lot of people want to be involved, but there are some barriers. So if people want to take a second to put in some thoughts in the chat box. Not your issue. I'm over engaged. Anybody else? Okay, well, I'm sure they're gonna come in. But yeah, we hear this, I don't know enough. That's a good one. Yeah, we hear a lot of different reasons why people don't engage. And what's interesting is every time I give this presentation, it doesn't matter where I am in the state. It doesn't matter who the audience is. It's some of the same things that keep people from engaging. And those are things like lack of civility in the form of hostility and personal attacks. That's a very real thing. Politics, being civically engaged, it opens you up to hearing a lot of things from people that are hard to hear. And not everyone's the best messenger. So that's one of the things that keeps people from engaging. But I gotta tell you, people are gonna disagree with you, and people are gonna say things that just aren't nice. And I usually just hide that comment on Facebook and keep it moving. So, whatever the hostility may be, the negative things that people are saying, your opinion does matter. And don't let someone who's loud stop you from exercising your opinion or prevent you from being involved in something that you care about. Another one is lack of info about issues, candidates, or processes. This is very, very common. It's hard to keep up with these things, especially environment, right? Especially climate change. Environment and climate change touch every aspect of our lives. The food that we eat, the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, the homes that we live in, how we get from our jobs, just so on. There's a whole list of topics that the environment touches. And so it can be hard to feel informed. It can be hard to feel like you know what you're talking about. But let me tell you something that is, maybe it's a secret, maybe it's not, but neither do our elected officials. So a lot of our elected officials we think are experts on every topic because they've been elected. That's not true. A lot of them don't know a lot about environment. They are issue experts in whatever they were doing before they became elected officials. So your knowledge on an issue, if you're passionate about it, if you take a little time to research it, get a couple of talking points but then what's more important than the talking points is your story and your experience. I have had people talk to elected officials, tell them their story. They weren't scientists, they weren't experts. They were people who were passionate and who were impacted by the issue. And they had that conversation with an elected official, and it was enough to flip that elected official's position on the issue to do something about it, right? So you don't have to be an expert. You just have to be someone that is passionate enough to take the time to learn about what you're passionate about and to talk to elected officials about it. I'll give you some ways to stay informed. Some of them are kind of, the usual, watching the news, reading the paper, but I'll give you a couple of more creative ways to stay informed in a bit. I guess really quick, Michael, how long do I have? Do I have till?
We have you scheduled until 8:30 because that included questions. So.
Okay, perfect. I was like, give. Sometimes elected officials, they can do things that make you feel like you can't trust them, and that is unfortunate. I'm seeing people hold their elected officials more accountable to the things that they're saying now that information is traveling faster. So I'm hoping that this will change. But even still, if you have an elected official that you no longer trust, or you have people that are engaging in politics that aren't necessarily your role model, no worries. You can elect someone different. You can put in some effort to do that. You can also become the role model for other people in terms of how you engage on this issue. So those are definitely challenges, but they can be overcome. Lack of how-to knowledge and skills. We do a lot of trainings. I do a lot of trainings. I know other organizations like Sierra Club do lots of trainings, teaching people how to talk to their elected officials, teaching people how to take action in different ways. So definitely it is a challenge. It's a little nerve-wracking the first time, for example, if you're gonna go talk to your legislator. I was sweating, I was shaky, but I did it, I did it and I learned from it. And I've gotten better at it. And so, you don't know, you only get better by practice, right? So if you don't know how to do something, don't let that stop you from trying to do it. You'll learn from it and you'll improve, you'll do better. And lack of facts and rampant information or fake news is my favorite thing. I like to say that, there's a lot of information out there these days, lots of talking heads. Lots of different information coming from news sources. It's up to us to really think critically about the information that we're getting and to form our own conclusions and to do our own research. We're never going to just get the straight scoop from one source, right? You're going to need to take in different perspectives and think about them and analyze them and figure out what works for you. And I think that if we did that more as a society, if we thought about the things that we received, if we took some time to form an opinion about it, we'd be better off than blindly listening to information that's been given to us. So these are all just thoughts, and maybe I'm helping to overcome some of these things. Maybe I'm not, but I like to offer that you're not alone and feeling some of these things that might make you want to not engage, right? The point is that you'll if you work past them and you start to engage anyway, you'll start to be rewarded, and you'll find that these things aren't as big of barriers as you built them up in your mind to be. And so I talked about giving you some ways to find policies to support. You can do these things. You can read the news. So watching the news, reading the news. I want to emphasize focusing on local media and not just national news. We tend to get really caught up in what the president is doing or not doing and what Congress is doing and not doing. And we're missing the fact that we have a state government that can be doing things. We have county governments that can be doing things and city governments that can be doing things. All of which I've seen cities take leadership on. 100% clean energy in Georgia. We've got cities like Atlanta and Savannah making those commitments. You've got counties like Athens, Clark County making those commitments. And so if you're focusing only on national news, you're missing some of those success stories happening locally. So I definitely encourage you to focus on local media when you're reading the news. Using social media, I can tell you anytime something happens, my feed is talking about it as soon as I log in. So social media is definitely one way to get the news. Follow pages, join groups, and as I said earlier, take everything with a grain of salt, especially on social media. But it is just a good way to kind of see what's on people's mind and what the topic du jour is. Talking to your friends. Your friends know a lot. Your friends know a lot. My friend just taught me a tip about cleaning vegetables from farmers markets. You catch me in person, I'll tell you what that tip is. But yeah, your friends know a lot. They know a lot of things. And so even if you're not the most active person on a particular topic, maybe your friend is. Maybe they know everything about what's happening with solar. Maybe they know everything about plastics policy. You know, my husband is someone that I go to for foreign policy because that's what he likes to watch. So your friends, the people that are close to you, they probably have some expertise. So ask them what they think, ask them what they know. That's a good way to find out information. Listening to podcasts. I'm definitely new to the podcast game, but I found some podcasts that I really like. If you can't stand CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, all of the things, that's okay. There's lots of podcasts from new voices, new people that are offering new perspectives on these issues. So take a second to broad podcast. You can find them on Spotify, or if you've got Apple, they've got a great podcast app. But that's another alternative way to get information. You can join an organization. You can join one like Georgia Conservation Voters, or all of the many wonderful environmental movements and organizations happening in Georgia. And then, of course, you can Google it. Google is my therapist. I got turned to Google every time I need something. And so you'll be surprised if you just Google, what plastic policy should I support? Boom, there's a ton of stuff out there on Google for you. So these are really great ways to find policies to support. There's no secret one-stop shop information hub, right? It's all over the place. So I usually offer some tips on talking to your elected officials. That's also known as lobbying, AKA. But I also want to talk about whether or not you know who your elected officials are, because we take for granted that people do know who their elected officials are. Most people know that there's 535 congressmen, there's 50 governors. There are over 500,000 elected officials in the United States, and that is a little overwhelming. So I like to make sure that people are thinking about more than just the ones we hear the most about, right? We hear president, we hear federal all the time, but again, there are local offices that make a big difference on environmental policy. So you've got your federal, we elect the vice president and a president. We also have 2 senators per state. So we've got 2 U.S. senators here in Georgia, both of whom are on the ballot in November. And in Georgia, there's also 14 congressional districts. So you're only represented by 1 congressperson, but there's 14 districts total in the state. We also have at the state level, a governor and a lieutenant governor that provide leadership for the state. A lot of questions about leadership at the state level lately, but we don't have all day to talk about that. So Georgia has 180 representatives and 56 senators. You have 1 of each. So you have 1 state representative and 1 state senator. At the county level, Georgia's divided into 159 counties. That is actually more than any other state except Texas. And so everyone lives in a county. So you should take some time to figure out what county you live in and who represents that county. And then there's cities. Not everyone lives in a city, but a lot of us do live in a city. I live in Atlanta, but if you live within a city boundary, you likely elect a mayor and city council people. So all of these levels of government have different roles in passing policies to protect the environment and mitigate climate. All of them have some level of power. We don't have to just depend on leadership from the federal government, although it would be nice. We know that there are smaller levels of government where we can make a big difference. And so to find out who represents you, if you don't know all of those levels of government, you can pull up the Empowered app. That's one really great app you can download. It's free. You plug in your address. They don't send you email and sign you up for a bunch of things, right? It's just an app. You can pull it up. It's actually a website now. You can do it online. But you just punch in your address and it tells you who represents you at every level of government: federal, state, county, city. It even has school boards on there, what school district you live in. If you want to do some green initiatives at your school, you can find your school board officials. And so I like that app because it tackles every level of government. It shows you a picture of the people. It gives you their contact information and their next election date. So Empowered is a really great app to find folks that represent you. If you want to go online, you can go to mvp.sos.ga.gov. That is the Secretary of State's website. So you can see what district you live in, you can view sample ballots, and you can check your voter registration there. Again, really important that you check your voter registration status. So that is one website that you can go to. It's the Georgia Secretary of State official website. And if you're just looking for state legislators, you can go to openstates.org/GA/legislators. That'll help you find your state legislators and get their contact information. So you don't have to talk to every single one of your elected officials, but knowing who they are is valuable, and it's important, because when you do want to talk to them, you want to be able to find them quickly and send them a message. So hopefully these resources are helpful for people. And then when you do talk to them, like I said, the first time I talked to an elected official, I was nervous, and I like to tell this story, but the first elected official I ever talked to was Stacey Abrams. She was my state representative at the time. And so, yeah, I went to the Capitol. I had never been in the Capitol before. I was shaky. There were a lot of people in suits, and I was nervous. And she was like, "Hey, Brionté, how can I help you?" And I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is so easy." And so I've been hooked. All right, I've been talking to elected officials ever since. So here's a few tips for talking to your elected official. Be clear about what bill you're referring to. If there is a bill, sometimes you just want to tell them generally how you feel, but if you can be specific about a bill that you're looking at, that's really helpful for them. They've got a lot of different pieces of legislation in front of them. Even at a city council or a county commission level, they're usually dealing with tons of bits of legislation. And so being specific helps. Be prepared to describe what the bill does or does not do and have a few talking points about it. So that's where, being a part of an organization can help get you some talking points about bills. And again, Google, great place to get your talking points. You find your facts that you want to use. Know that they're going to ask you questions. They might ask you what streets you live on, or where you like to play ball, or whatever it is, but make sure you keep them on track, because they usually don't have a lot of time and you want to stay focused on the topic. Try not to argue. It's not a good idea to argue with your elected officials. It's okay to disagree. An argument usually is not the best way to handle a disagreement. Oftentimes it gets them to dig their heels in and lock into their position. So if you disagree, the best thing to do is to continue to build a relationship with them, keep talking to them, try to offer them some evidence to support your position, tell them your story, talk about your story. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But arguing is usually not the best way to get your point across. And that same goes for name calling. There are a bunch of people that were harassing some elected officials, in Gwinnett County in particular. It's what stands out. They're people going and calling this man a name over and over again. He's still there. It didn't work. He's still there. So name calling isn't the best way to handle things. Threatening and is also not good. And also, if you don't know an answer to a question, because they will often ask you questions because they're trying to understand things better. If you don't know, best not to make something up, because you don't want to make something up and then they will take that and go talk to their colleagues, and then they don't want to find out they were wrong, right? Because then they're not going to trust you. So if you don't know the answer to the question, it's okay. Just say that you don't know. Go find the answer to that question and use that as an opportunity to come back to them and to continue building a relationship with them. They really do value it. And so these are all some tips. And so I want you to remember, tell your story. Talk about you. Talk about the impact on you. That is, we are creatures of stories, as humans are. We like stories. They pull at our heartstring. They take all of the numbers and facts in our mind and make them real and personal. And so your story is so important. And I hope that that you never feel nervous about sharing your own experience, because it is a valid experience. And then know that no one, not even our legislators, knows everything about every issue. Your opinion does matter. And that all action, no matter how small and isolated it seems, it contributes to the movement. Every single petition you click, someone's counting that. Every tweet you send, someone's counting that. Every email you send, legislators are counting that. A lot of times it can feel like we're doing things in a void, but all of it adds up. I promise you it adds up. So every action, no matter how small it seems, it contributes to the movement.
Hey, Brionté, really quickly, I just have to interrupt. Really? They count every tweet?
No, they do. So it depends. So if they are getting a ton of retweets, if your legislator is active on Twitter, I've heard them talk in the hallways like, yeah, there's about like 60 tweets on that. You see how many retweets? Because to them, that shows that this is getting traction, and that there are probably people in their district that are concerned about this. So they do count. If only one person tweets something at them, okay, whatever. But 40 tweets, that's much harder to ignore, right? And so every legislator has a threshold for when they're alarmed, right? For when they're just like, oh, those are just the crazy people, those just the environmentalists again, right? To, oh, wait, okay, so this is a big deal now, right? Now I've got 40 tweets in my inbox. Now I've got 60 emails in my inbox. And so, and I say that is mostly more relevant for people local. The smaller the more local the office, the more important the numbers. Because at a federal level, they're probably getting a lot of tweets, right? It's probably easier for them to ignore a lot of tweets. But for a state senator and a small district somewhere, 10 tweets is probably a landslide for them. So every elected official will treat them differently. It just depends on how many tweets there are overall, and whether or not they feel like those tweets are coming from people in their district. Is that helpful? You know this.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move into voting. So there are more important races than just the president on the ballot. So we've been talking a lot about the federal government in the news. Primaries are not quite over, but they're coming to a close. And so what I don't want people to do is check out because of the presidential election, right? There are plenty of other races that are on the ballot this year. And I want to say that you should vote, especially environmentalists. There's about 20 million registered environmental voters in this country, and I'm getting this data from the Environmental Voter Project. So about 20 million people who are registered voters who have strong environmental pro-environment views. And of those 20 million voters, in 2012, only 10 million of them actually hit the polls. And in 2014, a midterm election, even less than that, about 4.5 million of them hit the polls. So if so few environmentalists are voting, our elected officials will think that we're just not that important and we don't need to be listened to. And just think, if all 20 million of these pro-environment voters were hitting the polls consistently, what kind of elected officials would we they would be held accountable at the ballot box. So I think it's important to emphasize voting for environmentalists. I talked a little bit about it, but I'll say it again. Voters are being purged in the hundreds of thousands from the rolls here in Georgia. The most recent purge in December 2019 was 300,000 voters. That's 4% of the electorate, which is more than enough to influence the outcome of an election. And so other types of suppression that folks have experienced that Georgia has been under a microscope for are, exact match laws. So, people trying to register to vote and their names aren't exactly matching what's on their driver's license, they'll get denied. Precinct closures, inadequate machines, and more. And so the voters who are impacted by this are, as I mentioned earlier when I was talking about environmental justice, tend to be folks of color, younger folks. And so I think it's important to emphasize that people go register, check your registration if you're already registered. Just be vigilant that you stay on the polls. There's nothing more disempowering than showing up at the polls and being told you can't vote, right? And if you do show up at the polls and you are told that you can't vote, get a provisional ballot. Do not leave without casting your vote. You can usually work things out afterwards. So I just want to emphasize that. Here are some registration deadlines. I'll make sure that I send this presentation to Beth and Michael so that you all have them if you can't scribble the dates down fast enough. But we've had a lot of changes in our voting dates. So here's your voter registration deadlines and your adjusted election dates. Whoops, sorry. Right there. So we'll make sure we send it to folks. But the most important to note is that the primaries have been moved to June 9th. So our presidential primary and state primary has been moved to June 9th. And so, as I mentioned, there's lots of seats on the ballot. You've got your president. You've got 2 U.S. Senate seats in Georgia, which is a rare occurrence. It's also a big opportunity to get pro-environment people sent to Washington. We've got congressional seats. All of them are on the ballot. We've got state Senate seats. We've got state House seats. And there's also public service commissioners. Public service commissioners, they actually have a big role to play in whether or not we move to clean energy. They oversee the Georgia Power, our energy utility, the state's monopoly utility. And so if we're going to make progress on clean energy, it's really important that we elect public service commissioners that see that as a priority and that are willing to hold Georgia Power accountable to it. So all of these are important positions. All of these positions will be on the ballot this November. Take a moment to figure out who your candidates are and be prepared when you go to the polls. If you go to that Georgia Secretary of State website, you can view a sample ballot before you show up. Okay? And so I'm going to skip this because the same ways that you find policies to support are the same ways you can find elected officials to support: reading the news, social media, Googling, joining organizations, etc. These are all places where people who, if there's a great champion somewhere, there often can be found through these places. So I'm going to conclude with this slide. What can you commit to? I got to say that I'm probably a little overactive and I've done all of these things. You don't have to do all of these things, just 1 or 2. Pick 1 or 2 things, maybe 1 or 2 things that you haven't done before, or maybe just stick with the 1 or 2 things that you love. Again, every action, no matter how small, counts, and civic engagement will look differently for everyone. But yeah, I hope to see you around.
Brionté, man, this was fabulous. Thank you so much. Really, really powerful. Jillian, Jillian, you're running for office? Oh, good. Okay, good. All right. So I'm going to let you have the first question. I'm going to say one thing really quickly as an addition, and Michael and I both do this. So Michael and I serve as I think Michael's appointed. I'm definitely appointed. So I'm appointed to District 3 Community Council for DeKalb County. And I have to be honest, I hate it, but I feel like it's so valuable because the reason I hate it is because we end up with a bunch of NIMBYs, which is not my backyard people, but I feel like I've had a real input in how things are built and planned in DeKalb County. So that's one extra way you can serve. Michael, were you appointed?
I was appointed for the Environmental Sustainability Board. Yep.
So, and people who don't want to run and that kind of thing, serving on these boards really do have a lot of influence. And I just want to underscore, like, thank you for the power to the people. Support your elected officials, because your elected official could eventually end up your senator too. So if you start with them at the beginning, you know, you really have an opportunity to make a lot of influence. I like to be an influencer instead of actually an elected official. And I know influencer can be a little jaded in our current political environment, but you know, elected officials need specialists like us. They need someone that can go to an environmentalist and say, what do you think, right? So, okay, so Jillian, you get the first question, girlie.
Thank you so much, Beth, for putting this on and just being here for this. Thank you, Brionté, for chatting. You know, I've run into you in so many circles, but never like heard you just speak, which I thought was really cool.
Thank you.
So I currently work for the Sierra Club, starting out as a aspiring environmentalist, and like also working towards getting these cities towards 100%. And you know, as we're seeing with Savannah really baking in equity, I'm wondering like what sorts of like strategies, especially coming from like a white ally organization, can those equity priorities like be centered?
Yeah, and I think that's a good question, because a lot of communities are passing 100% clean energy, you know, ordinances and commitments, and they're still really figuring out how to actually deliver on them. And that's going to look differently for every city. But what's been consistent is the call for making sure that the way that it is implemented is more equitable. And I'll tell you some of the themes that I've heard when it comes to equity and 100% clean energy. One of them is energy burden, right? This idea that communities of color or lower income communities are spending more of their income, a greater share of their income on energy, and they're carrying more of a burden financially because of that. So one of the things that people are concerned about is that as we're implementing these 100% clean energy initiatives, and we're investing in more solar and putting more requirements on folks, that we're not increasing the cost of energy on these communities. And so there are just different ways to design the policy to minimize the increase in cost of energy for these communities. So it's something we have to be mindful of. And I'm not going to say that I know all the answers to how to do that, but in the conversations about what you're going to do, constantly asking the question, is this going to raise bills? Is this going to increase costs? And if so, what can we do to mitigate that, is a good way to show up in these conversations. Another one is energy assistance, right? So we've got lots of households that are struggling with that burden, that are struggling to pay their bills. So as we're talking about putting more money into solar and putting more money into, you know, expanding clean energy, we need to be talking about putting more money into energy efficiency, putting more money into bill payment assistance programs for communities. That is critically important. And so I think those are the main things I'll leave with, is making sure that as we're doing 100% clean energy, we're not bringing costs up, that we're thinking about how to mitigate those cost increases on communities of color, and that we're investing in energy efficiency as much as we're investing in renewable energy, and that we're investing in low income assistance for folks who are low income, who are struggling to meet their existing energy burden. So that's not complete, but if you keep those things in mind in these conversations, that's helpful in guiding the conversation to where it needs to be as the policies are being crafted.
Okay, so we've got questions. We got about 15 more minutes. Does anybody else have questions? Let's take advantage of Brionté while we have her.
You mentioned it takes a lot of people asking women to get them to run. Who was the last person that asked you, that got you, that made that straw break and got you to run?
I had a friend that I went to Georgia State University with, and we were both studying public policy together. And he said, "You should run for office." And I was like, "Oh no, I'm not qualified. Oh, I'm not ready. Maybe 10 years from now, I don't know." And that was what that he was the last person to ask me. And then shortly after that, Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms announced that she was going to run for mayor, and the seat, I lived in her district and it was an open seat. And so I said, well, it's an open seat, you know, and I care a lot about environment, and there was a lot going on with clean energy and resilience in the city, and I wanted to be a part of it. So yeah, my friend, you know, that conversation replayed in my head, and I was like, well, if he thinks that I could run, I'm going to run. So he was the last person that asked.
And I just wanted to mention that your alma mater, Georgia State University, is involved in Georgia Drawdown, as is UGA, Georgia Tech, and Emory.
I was like, I know I'm missing somebody, and of course I'm missing my institution, GSU, right? Beautiful, wonderful institution. It's a big part of how I ended up in the environmental space. I did not know that I was going to go into the environmental space. Georgia State presented an opportunity for me to get there. So yeah, absolutely.
So 3 of us on this conversation are working on a very hyper local issue, and I'm going to sort of pick your brain because I think this is good. So I'm going to leave it broad, but it is a hyper-local issue, and people who are our elected officials who we consider friends and friendly to the issue are being resistant. What is your best advice? And we're doing a lot of things, but I just want to hear what your best advice is. Like, how do you convict an elected official to like change their mind?
You have to, couple things. So this is such a good question. It's important to understand their values, right? You got to understand why their mind is set the way that it is. If you don't understand their values, it's hard to convince them or motivate them otherwise. You know, I value innovation. I value progress. If there's a better way to do something, I believe that we should do it. I got a 4-year-old. I want her to live in the best world possible. So I value a better future for my children and the other children. You know, these are my values, right? I also value being able to take a nice walk and unplug in a forest, right? These are the things that matter to me. And so, you know, someone's going to have a much easier time convincing me if they're talking to me about my values and talking to me about how whatever action it is they want me to take is consistent with my values, right? And so I think we don't think enough about where people are coming from and what's closest to their heart when we're trying to convince them. We're throwing facts and statistics at them, which might be helpful, but again, how does this relate to what I think is important? What gets me out of bed every day? What gets me excited? So figuring out values, I think, is number one. the second thing is figuring out the right messenger. What I've learned in Georgia is that I am not always the right messenger, and that's okay. That is okay. Sometimes you have to tap a friend or a family member or a colleague, or just get a different voice for someone to hear your message. And that's just, it's all about trust. I'm more likely to listen to a friend than I am some random person I just met on the street, right? So having the right messenger matters. I was actually reading about, how to get more conservatives to support environment and environmental initiatives. And one of the interesting things that I read was their children. If their children are talking to them about climate change and saying that they're concerned about it and they'd like to see action on it, they're more likely to change their mind and their opinion on that. Why? Because they value family. They love their children. They respect their children, and they don't want to let them down. I know I'm a parent. I don't want to let my daughter down. And so their children become much more effective messengers than people they view as being on the opposite side of the spectrum. And so values, understand their values, and to figure out the right messenger. And then the final thing is figure out the right message, what you can do if you have the right messenger and you understand values. Is that helpful?
That is incredibly helpful. And now I'm trying to think, okay, who is the mayor's best friend? I gotta get to them. So,
but that matters, like who they golf with, like all the things. These little things matter. So.
Right. So do we have any other questions? If not, we're going to let Brionté get back to her family.
Brionté, not to hold you up from your family, but I wanted to ask about the work you did to expand MARTA, and to talk a little bit about that and how you engaged communities in that.
Yeah, so just life transforming experience. It still brings me great joy thinking about the work that we did, and how much I cried when it passed. I still look at that picture. There's a picture of me in the paper, like with tears down my face, and I'm just like, oh my God, I look so bad. But it was such a passionate and exciting moment to see change being made, to see people advocating for something and getting it. That was just so transformative. And how I approached that was I showed up and listened. I listened for months. I started organizing in Clayton County in 2013 in June. And we didn't get the MARTA referendum on the ballot until July 2014. And it didn't get voted on until November 2014. So I started early. And I spent a lot of time just understanding the community. So I went to every meeting that I could possibly go to. I went to county commission meetings. I went to city meetings. I went to, they were doing a lot of stuff with the transportation sales tax at the time. So I went, it was a special purpose sales tax. So they're having lots of meetings about that. I went to that. I went to school board meetings. I went to Democratic Party meetings. I could not find Republican Party meetings. I'm sure they were meeting somewhere. So neighborhood association meetings, I went to as many places as I could, and I wanted to just kind of hear what people were saying. And so I sat in the back of the room quietly, taking notes, making note of messaging, making note of what was important to people. And then I was able to craft talking points. So again, these are, facts, just about how to get MARTA expanded. So a lot of people just didn't understand that MARTA was an option for them. And they didn't understand that the county commission had the power to place a referendum on the ballot. And so just giving the basics of how that worked was the first action that I took after listening. And then we were able to then give people points to talk to their neighbors and their friends about it, right? Why should we do it? Well, this is why we should do it. It'll get us back to school. It'll get us back to work. It'll help with vacancy rates, which Clayton County had a lot of vacancy because people left the county. They couldn't move around. And so there were a lot of different talking points, and different ones work for different people, but putting them all in one place helped people have those conversations with their friends and their family members. And as I mentioned, I was like, oh, we'll take cars off the road, yay. That messaging actually did stick by the end of the campaign because it was on the talking points list. So by the end of the campaign, the community was like, yeah, and of all the things that we've already talked about, we'll have cleaner air. So, you know, we made sure that the message, we led with the message that was most effective and most, you know, organic in the community. They wanted access to a better quality life. And that's what we focused on. And then we started to make sure that they knew that you talk, all that energy that you have, you talk to the decision maker. The decision maker was the county commission. It wasn't MARTA. It wasn't the mayors. We made sure that people were clear that the people who had the ability to thumbs up or thumbs down were the county commissioners. And once people knew that, it was a wrap. They were calling them, emailing them, catching them, you know, at church, getting wherever they were at, grocery stores, like they were talking to their county commissioners and telling them what they wanted. And so we did ultimately get that referendum on the ballot. It was a successful vote. Over 74%, if I'm 73 or 74, I'm a little foggy on the number all these years later, but it was a landslide in favor of it. And I think since then it's been exciting because we've seen different investment in public transit in the city of Atlanta. We've got the ATL now, which will allow other counties to get transportation. So it was to me that's how you start. You listen, you give people the facts, you help them understand who the decision maker is, and you encourage them to talk to their neighbors and the decision maker, and that's how you get the change.
Hey, I have a question. I'll show you my video too. Hi, I'm Kate. I am actually in Las Vegas and not in Georgia. I met Michael during a Sierra Club meeting, and he's invited me to these. Sorry, I'm looking to the side. That's for your faces. He's invited me to these great, cool events that you guys are hosting, and so I have a kind of different question since I'm not in Georgia. I hope to eventually make Georgia my home, but currently I'm an environmental justice and climate justice organizer in Nevada, and we don't have public transportation. Like, we have a bare bones public transportation, and it's been pulling teeth to get any investment in it. We also have like endless sprawl in our city, and so I recently created a climate justice coalition, environmental justice coalition, where we're starting to do this work. But we're super new and still working on establishing ourselves. And so I guess I'm interested in kind of hearing how, if you were starting from scratch in pushing the justice lens when talking about these issues, how, I guess, where would you start? How would you start? Mm-hmm. I mean, we have, like all environmental and climate justice, we have a million things to do, but like, I guess, any words of advice for us?
Yeah, so it's kind of just back to what I was saying with how I got started in Clayton County. You should listen to the community that you're organizing, right? So you've got some people that are part of your group, but there's a lot of people in the community who are not a part of your group, and it's important for you to get their perspectives. There's a tool, if you Google it, it's called community mapping. I encourage you to create a community map. So it's like, what are the churches, where are the grocery stores, you know, where are the fraternities and sororities, you know, all the different gathering places for people. And then you can create a plan for, okay, we're going to hit these meetings. We're going to go to these meetings. We're going to listen to folks. And from there, you'll start to hear what the community is focused on and what their top concerns are. Because like in Clayton County, no matter where I was at, people were talking about the same things, right? They were talking about sidewalks. They were talking about jobs. They were talking about criminal justice. These were the same things that they were talking about everywhere. So a community map gives you a good idea of what is in your community, gives you a guide for where you should start to go to listen, and then listen to what they're saying. What are they talking about? What are they concerned about? Write that down, and then find a way to connect that to your issue and what you're trying to get done. And then my other tip about transportation is find the funding. You know, it's easier to advocate to get something passed when you know how it's going to be paid for. So think about how you're going to fund it, because that's what makes the difference for transit.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. I feel like that last piece, find the funding, is big on almost any huge climate thing we want to do. Like it transcends transportation, but also goes into anything else that we want done, especially in the age of COVID, where like I'm hearing my elected officials say, like, this session, because we do sessions every other year, they're like, this session we're only going to like rewrite rules so that it's easier to do things in the future, because Nevada's out of money. Our unemployment is going to take out a huge chunk of our budget, since like 70% of our workforce is out of work. Like, we are in a bad spot. Yeah. The Strip employs so many people, and like around it employs so many people, and it's all shut down. And so a lot of our money is going to that. And so our state is out of money. And so it is interesting to reassess how we're going to do this work in the age of COVID, especially like, how do you do community meetings or show up to listen when they aren't meeting, or they aren't meeting in person, and trying to find those avenues online. We have our work cut out for us for sure.
Yeah. Well, hopefully I'll share this presentation, but I'm actually really easy to find. I'm a Google search away. So if you ever have questions,
I just followed you on Twitter, so will do. Appreciate it. Thank you for presenting. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we're going to wrap up. Thank you, Brionté, so much. This has just been awesome. We just cannot thank you enough. This will go up on YouTube and be shared throughout all my little groups and Facebook. I reach about 30,000 people, so don't worry. We just appreciate your passion and your commitment and your leadership and your voice to make this place better. I mean, really, this has really been amazing. So thank you so much, and we're going to sign off. Y'all have a good evening.
Thanks, Brionté.
Stay safe.